this discussion. I'm really excited to see a lot of both familiar and new faces. So, in order to fully understand the oppression of women and to way forward today, we have to examine several issues, current events, the history of the women's movement, and the development of class society. A Marxist analysis of women's oppression is not merely a footnote, but an essential part of understanding capitalism and its development. Many people claim that throughout the existence of humanity, women have always been secondary and always will be. They'll point to faulty bioessentialist arguments kind of masqueraded as science while ignoring the facts. For centuries prior to the development of class society, men and women largely lived as equals. It was a split into those who work for a living and those who own the production, like owning land or owning factories, that this inequality between men and women began. At the very center of this society is the rigid allocation to certain roles to men and to women. The ruling class ideology that's pushed on working people says that the primary role of women is having and raising children, who will be the next generation of workers. In addition to child-rearing, the responsibility of unpaid domestic labor, like cooking or laundry, is placed with women. This systematic subordination is deeply tied to the idea that women do not have the right to control their own bodies. And while I plan to delve further into these issues later, I think it's really important to note that since January, over a dozen bills attacking reproductive rights have entered into Congress, and many have already passed in the House. In conjunction with all of this is the deep pay gap between men and women. For every dollar made by a man, women make between 55 and 77 cents, depending on their race, with women of color making the least. Likewise, the majority of minimum wage and tipped workers are women. Now, I'm talking about a lot of different issues here, but what do they all mean in relation to each other and to the system at large? Ultimately, the roots of these issues lie with capitalism's relentless drive for profit, the exploitation of domestic labor, the attacks on reproductive rights, and equal work for unequal pay are all necessary to divide and conquer working people and sustain capitalism. When analyzing these problems, we can't simply look at them as issues that impact all women, rich or poor, equally. On the other hand, we can't just blame men for supposedly being some type of backwards tyrants. So let's start by looking at the context surrounding childcare. Today, we have a system of incredibly expensive, privately owned childcare, where more often than not, it's inaccessible for working class women. This economic barrier strips women of the freedom to decide when and whether to have children, or to stay home or work. Alongside this is the rising cost of college tuition, healthcare, and housing combined with low wages. In the US and around the world, there's been a long struggle for childcare. In the 1960s and 70s, we saw a vibrant women's movement that made many bold demands, one of which was free 24/7 childcare. This was a key demand of many rallies, marches, and political meetings, kind of like this one, but one of the largest was the Women's Strike for Equality in 1970. This strike drew 20,000 people in New York City and correlated with several smaller actions throughout the country and even some throughout the world. Slogans like, "Don't iron while the strike is hot," and "Storks fly, why can't mothers?" played a vital role in galvanizing women everywhere and making major headlines. The pressure of this movement forced Congress to overwhelmingly pass a bill that would establish a national daycare system. However, it was vetoed by Richard Nixon in 1972. And I thought his reasoning was ideal for this discussion. He said that it would make American women like Soviet women, and it would wreck the traditional family. What Nixon was referring to was the network of child care centers that were established after the Russian Revolution. This transfer of responsibility for children from the individual household to society as a whole means less dependence on men and the elevation of the social and economic position of women. Another pertinent issue facing working women is the constant attack on reproductive rights. In Texas in 2013, we saw a 20-week abortion ban and major cuts to women's health services. This attack on women is in one of the largest states in America. It is not isolated. State by state, Planned Parenthood and other similar health facilities are being closed and defunded by Republican-dominated legislatures. Across the pond, Irish women have been mobilizing against the 8th Amendment of the Irish Constitution, which bans abortion. Our sister organization in Ireland, the Socialist Party, has played a major role in this struggle. this Irish group called ROSA, which stands for Reproductive Rights Against Oppression, Austerity, and Sexism, alongside Socialist Party, TD, which means Member of Parliament, Ruth Coppinger, a member of our organization, has been fighting for a referendum against this amendment. Like the Labour Party in Ireland has not defended women's rights, the Democratic Party in the US has not defended them at all. While socialists stand as uncompromising and unrepentant supporters of a woman's right to choose when or whether to have children, Democrats have repeatedly promised to prevent abortion from being covered by Obamacare. Texas Senator Wendy Davis, who's most famous for her filibuster against anti-choice legislation in the Texas legislature, came out in support of a 20-week abortion ban just a few months later. That wasn't simply some liberal electoral ploy. It was a part of a direct offensive against working women. 42% of women who get abortions have incomes below the federal poverty level. Likewise, the most frequent reason cited by women terminating their pregnancies is their inability to afford the enormous cost of raising a child. This is a part of the reason that reproductive rights is a class issue. Wealthy women have always been able to afford private physicians or travel to other states or countries when abortion is illegal or heavily restricted in their region. On the other hand, working class women are the most likely to seek an abortion and the least likely to have access to one. This disenfranchisement of women is deeply tied to the gaping gender pay gap that we have. The United States ranks 67th out of 133 countries, right below Yemen, in pay equity. This shocks a lot of people, especially considering that the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963. Since then, this problem hasn't really improved, and in fact it's gotten worse in many cases, and this is very much tied to the decline in union membership, because women who are members of unions are more likely to have equal pay to their male counterparts. This implementation of steps forward, like the Equal Pay Act, is not possible without major public pressure from an organized movement to enforce it, much like the movement that's coming in Seattle to enforce the $15 an hour minimum wage. While many politicians talk about equal pay, they do not and will not take action. It's up to us to organize and mobilize to fight for our rights. It's only through a fundamental change in our material conditions that women's liberation is possible. A strong, unified women's movement that stands in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, the movements for LGBT rights, immigrant rights, and labor is vital. Our oppression is so strongly tied together, and for many women, it's overlapping. We have to fight for a major expansion of women's reproductive health care and vehemently defend a woman's right to choose whether and when or whether to have children. We need to demand accessible, free abortion under a publicly funded single-payer healthcare system. We need to demand maternity and paternity leave and fully subsidized childcare. We need to build a mass party of working people and youth to fight for a socialist world, because it's the only democratically planned economy that will create the conditions for women's liberation. Only then will people be able to have control over their own lives. Thank you.